Welcome to the Rob Call Bottom Up Show, sponsored by opednews.com, available on Pacifica Radio Network, Progressive Radio Network, on iTunes, at opednews.com/podcasts, on SoundCloud, Stitcher, and other places. My guest for this show is somebody who I encountered on the Positive Psychology listserv. I've been on that listserv for, 18, 19, 20 years, something like that. And positive psychology is a field I've been long interested in. And the best I can tell, I organized the first conference on it and I presented back on it in 1985. My guest is Jer Clifton from the University of Pennsylvania Department of Psychology, and he's the co-author of an article, Primal World Beliefs, published in the Journal of Psychological Assessment. I think this is a really important paper, and I'm excited to have Jer on to talk about it. Welcome to the show, Jer.
Thank you, Rob.
And so you have a little story you want to tell us about your name.
Oh, yeah. So I go by Jer Clifton, but my full name is Jeremy Clifton, and I stutter. And I used to hate to meet people because I would meet them, I would get stuck on my name, and they think that I'm trying to say a joke or something like that. And I would get annoyed because if I'm trying to say a joke, it's going to be a funny joke, right? Like, or I hope it is. So my first day in college, I met somebody and I was shaking their hand and I got stuck on my name. And that's the worst too, when you shake someone's hand and get stuck on your name, because then you just keep shaking. You just can't stop. And he cut me off and said, Jer, that's a great name. And I was like, great idea. And like, since then I've been Jer. And so everyone before that day calls me Jeremy, and everyone since then calls me Jer. And I like to tell that little tale too, just to let people know that I do stutter and ask a bit of patience with me.
Nice. I like that. That's a great story. I have a similar one, not because of stuttering, but I used to go by Rob, and that's what my family members call me. Then in high school, people started calling me Bob. And then my mom died, and I felt that her calling me Rob, particularly as she was dying, reminded me that that's where my heart is connected. So I now I go by Rob, and I have for the last 25 years, I guess. Wow. I can't believe it's that long. So you have this paper out called Primal World Beliefs. And 3 little words, opening up a lifetime for you, it looks like.
Yeah.
What are they?
Primal world beliefs are our most basic beliefs about the world as a whole. We don't really know that we have them. We might know about 1 or 2 of them. And before our research, depending on how you count, between 2 and 4 of these beliefs had been studied, and they were looked at in different fields. And they didn't really talk to each other. And we thought that people might have a whole bunch of these beliefs. And if we have them, it's possible that much of who we are and become in life might be a reaction to these beliefs that we didn't know that we had. So I had this idea when I was 19 that we could have these beliefs. And I've been obsessed about it since. And this is the first time that I've been able to get the ideas out there. So I'm very pumped up about it.
And you put together quite a team to study this. You and Joshua D. Baker, Crystal L. Park, David B. Yadin, Alicia B. Clifton, Paulo Turney, Jessica Miller, Guang Zheng, Salvatore Giorgi, Andrew Schwartz, and Marty Seligman, considered the father of positive psychology. That's quite a crew. So, and this is your first psychological paper that you've published.
Yes. So I'm a PhD student, although I guess technically now I'm a doctoral candidate under Marty Seligman. And he brought me on to study these beliefs. And I've been spending the last year trying to identify all of the main primals that humans hold and trying to figure out a way to measure them. And to do that, I had to do a whole bunch of things that I had to learn how to do because my background was not in science. And it's fun now. I'm a measurement expert to some degree, and I think it's super fun. I used to be a philosopher. And I think that when philosophers get into how to measure stuff, it's really fun because you really have to hone in on exactly what you mean and what you don't mean and whatnot. And to do this paper for the last 5 years of work, I had a ton of help. So I was super glad that we could put a ton of people on the paper who definitely did things that I could not do. So for instance, the third author named Crystal Park, she's an expert in how to measure psychological constructs. And I've been calling her up like once a month or so to get advice on this or that. I called her up being like, oh my God, I completely forgot this thing. And she's like, it's okay. This is what we do in this context. And so she's been great. Josh Baker.
All right, I don't want to get too much into all the credit.
No, sure.
You got that on the paper, and
okay, sounds good.
Got a lot to talk about. So
sure.
I want to kind of throw out some ideas that I kind of gleaned from looking at your work, and then we can talk about it more.
Sure.
You talk about primals as a class of primary beliefs that shape and influence well-being, behavior, and personality, right?
Yes.
Okay, and you refer to a concept that is in some way similar that has been used in the past, a German term, Weltanschauung, which is an amalgam of political, religious, and moral doctrines.
Yeah.
And there has been some research before on beliefs, and you mentioned the 5 big ones.
The 5 big ones.
Right?
Which 5 big ones are you talking about?
I don't know. You refer to it in your paper a couple times.
You mean the big 5 traits?
The big 5 traits, yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's not on beliefs. Those are like extroversion, neuroticism, those things. Yeah.
5 traits.
Yeah.
All right. Okay, so we'll get around that. And you say that primals are conceptual dimensions anchored by opposites.
Mm-hmm.
Talk about that.
Well, so each primal. So, for instance, one of the primals, the main one that was studied before our work, was the belief that the world is a just place, and this is the idea that the world is a place where a being would get what they deserve and deserve what they get. And then people would talk about if you would score high or low on this belief scale. Now, the thing is that scoring high means that you see the world as a more just place. Scoring low means that you see the world as more of an unjust place where you don't get what you deserve. And so I wanted it to be clear, like I study the belief that the world's a safe place. Scoring high on the thing that I call safe means that you see the world as a safe place. If you score low on it, it means that you tend to see the world as a dangerous place. And that's true of all 26 beliefs that we can now measure.
All of them can be categorized as either BJW, belief in a well, no, you changed it. You just changed it from belief in a just world to belief in a safe world versus a dangerous.
Yeah, I was saying like just how a scale of belief in a just world scale, what it means to score high and low on a belief in just world scale means that you believe different things. You believe opposite things about the world. In the same way, for all 26 of my scales, depending on if you score high or low, you believe opposite things about the world. So you can see the world as an abundant place if you score high on that scale, or a barren place if you score low on the abundant scale. You see the world as a safe place if you score high on the safe scale. If you score low on the safe scale, you see the world as a dangerous place, and so on and so forth. So that's what I meant by these beliefs are distributions between conceptual opposites.
And what are some of the items on the scale?
Well, all of them involve some sort of noun that refers to either the world as a whole, most places and most situations, or something like that. And then something like is a safe place. So one question is, one item is, on the whole, oh yeah, on the whole, the world is a safe place. Another question is, no matter where you are, there is always something fascinating going on.
Now,
Like,
those are so.
like that.
And the next thing I have is you listed 6 criteria: that they be simple, adjectival, goal relevant, maximally general, automatic, and active.
Mm-hmm.
And the automatic means operating primarily beneath cognitive awareness in the, quote, System 1 family of cognitions, which I have no idea what System 1 means.
Oh, so Danny Kahneman won the Nobel Prize in economics for some of this work just a couple years ago, I believe. But basically, one of the things that he's worked on is drawing this distinction between top-down cognitive processes and processes that we're not aware of that are implicit. So, for instance, you might think of what you said before, Weltanschauung beliefs. So this is the beliefs like, do I have free will? Is there a God? What are gender roles, etc.? A lot of those beliefs are like doctrines that you hold, and you know that you hold them. What primals are is they're more like the beliefs that were of interest to people like Beck when he came up with a cognitive therapy. These are beliefs that we don't always know that we have, that guide how we interpret the things that are going on around us without us knowing that they're doing that.
Yeah, you grabbed my attention when you talked about Daniel Kahneman's top-down ideas. So tell me a little bit more about that.
Well, I don't know a ton about Kahneman. He's in the judgment and decision-making world. But he did a lot to draw tension between these two types of processes. System 1, that happen without you intending to do it. You don't have really control over how these implicit beliefs and biases and tendencies affect you. And System 2 stuff that you do have control over. So, like, I don't have control how I interpret the color that is coming from the screen right now. My brain automatically takes the color and lines that I see and pieces your face together. That's a System 1 process.
Okay, I got it. So, in my exploration of top-down and the top-down and bottom-up world, I've had conversations with neuroscientists who talk about top-down brain processing, and that involves kind of filtering. You're talking about primals, but I've thought about this concept a decent amount in terms of it being kind of different filters that we see the world through. I look at it and George Lakoff has written about it in terms of cognitive filtering, metaphoric filtering.
Mm-hmm.
Have you looked at that at all?
Well, I'm curious, what do you mean by top down and bottom up? I think that at times people can use those terms differently.
Yeah, and that's why I wrote a whole book about it coming out in May.
Great. Congrats.
Thanks. But top down in terms of the brain, it generally means that you're processing your experience in some way. In other words, you're using your prefrontal cortex and your executive function so that when you take in raw, bottom-up sensory information, you're going to process it. And it sounds to me like that's exactly what you're describing, these primal beliefs do to people.
Yeah. No, I think that's about right. There's this great phrase from Emerson, he was responding to Weltanschauung thinking at the time, and he asked, "Does the world wear our color?" And I just love that idea, because I'm basically, I feel like millions of people have been trapped in these implicit worlds that they assumed everyone else is in. But they didn't have a language with which to discuss it. And they didn't know that it was that different.
Yeah.
We kind of tend to assume that other people see the world the way that we do. And so when other people act, like, I tend to see the world as quite safe. Like, if you saw the world as very unsafe, I might, and you react to that in a responsible way, that would mean that we'll do things like, I'll make sure that I lock my door at night. I'm going to be a bit more jumpy. I'm going to assume that threats are more real in any given context. And
you also talk in your paper about how people who tend to see the world as more dangerous tend to be more conservative too. So they might also vote for the guy who says, I'm going to fight crime.
Well, that's what's interesting, is that so we've been doing more research on the primals that predict who you vote for. There is a statistical difference between conservatives and liberals when it comes to safe, but it is very small. So it's shockingly small, and it's way smaller than people in the past have thought. Like, I felt that I was just wrong. Like, conservatives and liberals tend to see the world as more or less equally safe, but we're just scared of different things in different ways. And what's predictive of who you vote for is a much more interesting tale. I'm not sure if you want me to go.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay. So there's 3 primals that are quite predictive of who you vote for. And they vary across the spectrum. So it's more predictive of Trumpers, slightly less of never Trumpers on the right, versus Clinton versus Bernie
Sanders.
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
Well, let's start with the third one. The third most predictive primal of who you vote for is the belief that the world is getting better. If you tend to think that the world is getting better, a logical response to that is to, hey, let's speed this change up. This is great. Let's go. If you think that the world is getting worse, a rational response to that is to assume that you probably need to be skeptical of change and constrain that change. The second biggest primal when it comes to who you vote for is the belief that the world is a just place. I mentioned before that this was a belief that was studied before me. This is the belief that the world is a place where you get what you deserve and deserve what you get. So if you're sick, it probably means that you didn't take care of yourself as much as you should have. If you're poor, you might not have worked hard enough to deserve more. Now, the problem is that it's not just a bad thing where you blame victims. People who see the world as a just place also do have a tendency to work harder and are nicer, because the world is a place that rewards hard work and being nice. And so it's a bit of a double-edged sword there, and there's some more complexities that we could get into. And the most predictive primal of who you vote for by quite a bit is the belief that the world is a hierarchical place. I studied on that a little bit, but yeah, so this is the belief that everything can be ranked by how important or good it is. It implies that difference means that something is better or worse than something else. And if you think that sounds a bit insane, it's just as weird to flip that around and to assume that difference implies nothing. So someone can have the assumption that all things are pretty much the same. So this like frames these two like sins both on the right and the left, because a extreme lefty can be like, no culture is better or worse than another. And personally, I'm like, that's not true. Some cultures are fan of female genital mutilation, and I think that's just wrong. And I don't care what culture you're in. But on the other hand, there's lots about different groups and cultures or whatever that is just different, and is not better or worse. So these two groups tend to make errors in different directions. So if the world
let me digress for one moment.
Okay, please.
Is in your paper, is there a list of these 20? Was it 25 categories?
26 beliefs. So in the paper, I focus on probably at the end, there's this section where I really try to flesh out the three main beliefs that we have. Because what you have here is you have 22 beliefs, most of which claps down into 3, and most of which claps down into 1. Does that make sense? So you have the structure of our beliefs. I didn't have time in the paper itself to really dive into the 22, but Rob, we published a 500-page appendix that goes along with this paper that you just read. Like everything, like the journal that we published in, like people thought that I was being completely absurd to even float this, that we should publish this alongside, and thought that we would be laughed out of the room. And they accepted it. And it's like multiple times longer than the longest stuff that they've published, but you don't need to read it. The point is that the paper just tries to establish that these beliefs exist and we can measure them, and they're doing all the things that we thought that they would be doing, but it doesn't get into exactly the nature of each of these beliefs at all. It doesn't get into politics really very much at all. That's a whole nother paper that.
Okay. Yeah, it is. So I interrupted you. You were talking about the two related to hierarchical.
Well, so I just wanted to then tie those three together. Okay. So if conservatives tend to think that the world is a hierarchical place, a naturally hierarchical place that's just, and that's going downhill, then a natural response to that is we need to constrain change. If you believe that the world is a fundamentally non-hierarchical place where things aren't better or worse than each other, it's an unjust place, and it's getting better, then you're like, yeah, no, the system is not bad, and we need to speed up the process of making it better. And I like to talk about these beliefs because my hope is that in the long run, it allows people to see the other side. Like no matter where you are on the spectrum, it allows to see people who are way more extreme than you on both ends as making a little bit more sense.
Okay, so, and I don't think I don't remember seeing it in the paper. Do you talk about how people get these primal beliefs?
I do not talk about that at all. So at the very end, I outline 8 different disciplines that we want to see a lot more work done on these beliefs. One of them is developmental. We really have very little idea where these beliefs come from. However, a chapter of my dissertation and a number of papers that I'm going to work on is definitely going to look at this. And one of the big things that we want to talk about is myths that I think people will have about where these beliefs come from. So for instance, we can measure the belief now that the world is an abundant place versus a barren place. And someone might think, oh, well, if someone has a great life and a ton of money and had good education, of course, they'll tend to think the world is abundant. People who are poor, don't have a lot of opportunities, will tend to think the world is barren. And that is just completely false. Like of all the samples that we've looked at so far, that is not true. These are filters, as you say, that we put on the world. But they're not that driven, from what we can tell so far, by what happens to us. We tend to filter out information that is inconsistent with what we've gone through. And if a bad thing does occur, Like, let's say I think the world is a safe place. If a bad thing does occur, I might tend to see that unsafe thing that occurred as an exception to the rule. So,
Or
like,
as a blessing in disguise, or
exactly. So,
cloud
like,
with a
the
silver
world,
lining. There's all kinds of metaphors.
exactly, exactly. The world is a giant set of data that we can use to confirm or deny whatever belief that you have, if you're not like actively trying to find what would be true about it. And I say true in quotes, not because I don't think there is truth out there, but if my work demonstrates anything, is that we massively disagree on the world's most important qualities. And we didn't really know
wait,
it.
stop there. We need to do a brief show ID, and we'll come back with the world's most important qualities.
Okay.
So for the show ID, I just need a pause for the radio show so I can edit in a bumper, and we'll just pause and have a silent moment here. My guest for this show is Jer Clifton, a grad student, a doctoral candidate at the University of Pennsylvania Department of Psychology, and he's a co-author of a groundbreaking article that I'm very excited about, Primal World Beliefs. And Jer, you're going to tell us about world's most important, what was it?
Well, I think that the 26 beliefs that I have identified, that we've identified, describes essentially most, if not all, of the 26 most important qualities about the world. And
Okay.
so my research, if it's done anything, what I hope it's done is it can begin to convince people that they disagree with other people and potentially their spouse, their kids, their colleagues, their friends, about fundamental traits that they think that the world has. And if they disagree with those things, then that suggests they should live their lives in quite different ways.
Now, I want to just cover how you came up with these concepts, because it's a really cool bottom-up approach that you took. Totally bottom-up, really. I mean,
Thank you.
You analyzed 14 sacred texts,
Mm-hmm.
100 novels, 100 films, 100 speeches, 71 treatises, and 80,677 tweets, beginning with the world is, the universe is, or everything is.
Mm-hmm.
And now that's like, it doesn't get much more bottom up than that, really.
Yeah. No, one of the things that so a lot of this started, like, I got into the program and I got funding to work on this stuff after I wrote a capstone in the Masters of Applied Positive Psych program here at
Capstone? What's a capstone? And what was
It's just a master's thesis. And in that thesis, I identified 13 beliefs, 13 of these beliefs that I thought might matter. And I could go into that, but it's not that important. The point is that I went home and talked to my mom the next week. And she's like, oh, beliefs about the world, like the belief that the world is an
connected.
Yeah, a interconnected place, right? And I was like, oh, yeah, that's one that I just totally didn't think of. And basically, I realized these are a fish's belief about water. Like me, like an individual fish, cannot hope to identify all of the main ways that people might vary. And so we just had a lot of people doing a lot of different things for about 3.5 years to try to identify all of the possible beliefs that one might have. So we looked at, as you mentioned, films. We looked at everything from Batman to Shakespeare to the people here had a database of 2.4 billion tweets. One of the things that was a personally a super fun thing for me to do, and this is like a nerd's dream come true, is I got to invite 10 top intellectuals from around the country to come talk about these ideas for 3 days. And that included like Carol Dweck and Aaliyah Crum at Stanford, and David Sloan Wilson. You might have known some of his books. Just like a whole bunch of people. And we talked about like which of these beliefs might matter and how we might identify more among a bunch of different things. We had 22 interns looking through texts. It was just amazing. And we had focus groups amongst the world's biggest religions. And my job was to essentially sort all of these inputs, edit a classification of beliefs that people might hold, and then send that classification out to other people who would then mark it up and send it back. And through that, we engaged about 55 experts in
I must say that as I was reading about your process of doing this, I thought, while you're looking at everything, the world, the universe, I wondered if you looked at Seinfeld, which was about nothing. And Larry David.
No. That's a great point. So on Twitter, we found that the phrase "nothing is" didn't work that well. Like we had higher error rates. That they weren't really making a claim about the world as a whole and how we define that. But when we look through all of those texts that you mentioned, we looked through 5 phrases, and one of them was "nothing is." So we did do the Seinfeld approach as well, I think.
Oh, so I only have 3 here: world, universe, and everything. So you also had nothing. What was the 5th one?
Did we have life is?
Life. Okay. Yeah, that wasn't in the paper.
Yeah. No. It's in the paper. It just wasn't used for the tweets.
Okay.
So those 5 were for all of the novels and all of the texts that we looked at.
All right, and I'd be interested in, but we're not going to have time. I'd love to hear how you pick the novels and films and speeches. But
well, it's again, if someone wants to look at it, it's all in the appendix. But just in the short frame is that we did not come up with any of those lists ourselves. We picked pre-existing texts based on experts in those fields.
Got it. Okay. And you got funding from the Templeton Foundation, which has had a history of funding positive psychology. What was your pitch to them that got them to give you funding?
My pitch to them is that, so one of the things that I like about Templeton is that they take risks on ideas that could be wrong, but if they're right, would be very important to find out. And I pitched this to them as, it may be that a massive chunk of who we are and become in life is in reaction to these beliefs that we didn't even know that we had. And they were like, great. So they gave me a grant too that was a planning grant. It actually wasn't a research grant. And we're still in discussion now about what a larger grant would look like. But they remain interested, I guess. And that's like all I should say at this point, except that we're really hopeful. Like now that these beliefs have been measured, and there's definitely certain of these beliefs that excite me and that I want to study, but I kind of feel that, when Lincoln signed he signed a law that allowed for the settlement of the West, and it led to a massive demographic change as people moved west. And what he did is that he allowed for all this land to be split up into individual plots that gave people something small and concrete to settle. Now, I'm interested in primals, but now we need a whole bunch of papers and a whole bunch of studies that attack particular primals and particular outcomes. Like, where does this particular primal come from? Like the belief that the world's a safe place. Where does that come from? How does that primal relate to being a neurotic person? And we need a whole set of studies done on just that. So my hope is that this is kind of mapped a space and carved it up into a whole bunch of different niches that people can actually, that's like bite size in a paper or in a dissertation. But who knows? We'll see.
Going through your paper, I'm not sure that I have a list of those primals, the 26 beliefs. Are they in the paper?
So they're the only time that they are mentioned in the paper is in the table that gives all of the questions themselves. And then at the very end, when it has the graph of the structure of all these beliefs. So it might be useful just to lay out what the structure is.
Okay, so, yeah, do that.
So basically there's 22.
Is that this graph here?
Exactly, that's the graph. So that represents the structure of what we think is the implicit world that we live in. So you've got 22 beliefs along the bottom.
Can I copy this and put this in when I publish our interview? Can I include that? Great.
Sure. That's totally fine with me. So we have 22 statistically independent beliefs about the world as a whole that are to an important extent doing their own things and predictive of different things. Then you have most of those, not all, you have 5 of them on the side that are doing their own thing. You have most of those collapsing down into 3 main beliefs about the world. And those are really the 3 that most of your viewers should grab here. They're the most important ones, I think, by far. And that's the belief that the world is a safe place, that the world is a enticing place, and the belief that the world is alive. Each of those have sub-beliefs to them, and you can dive into those, and that's fun, and that's cool, and that's important. But those 3 are the main ones. And then safe, enticing, and alive claps down further, if you want, into an overall belief that the world is a good place. And that is by far the single most important primal world belief that we have. It is massively predictive of a whole bunch of things that includes well-being and gratitude and optimism and curiosity and blah, 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 blah.
But this is all positive. What the other side of it is that it's a dangerous place. Now you said that that they're all paired. They're all anchored
paired
by opposites.
Yes, they're all paired. And in fact, every single one of these scales is measured by reverse scored questions that load on those scales and no other scale. So we know.
What does that mean, reverse scored questions?
That's a great question. Reverse scored questions are just, so for instance, I measure the belief that the world is a good place I can do it through a question that's forward scored, and it goes like, most things in the world are good. Or I can ask, on the whole, the world is a uncomfortable and unpleasant place. And
you say that word again.
Unpleasant place.
Unpleasant.
And that measures the belief essentially that the world is a bad place. And those mirror each other. So that's trying to measure one thing. So I could put it this way. If I was trying to measure your belief that you're a tall person, and I ask you, do you consider yourself a tall person? And you give me some response. And then I ask, do you think of yourself as a short person? If that second response doesn't mirror the first response, but going the other way, then I don't know what I've measured.
Right. Okay.
Like it has to, and when you measure beliefs, for me, that was extremely important because I need to know what belief I exclude. Like I can't, that's what gives meaning to each side of these beliefs. And this can get very philosophical very quickly. But the point is that I thought it was very important to know exactly what it meant to score high and to score low in every single belief.
So when you have this graph, there's going to be a counterpart to it that is
Yeah,
unsafe. Uh,
exactly. So yeah, let's
what's the opposite of enticing?
dull, boring.
Dull or boring? Oh, okay.
Yeah, alive means cold and dead, and indifferent.
You
The
know, it's. I got to throw a couple thoughts at you.
no, please, please.
We have, but when it comes to the roots of these, it one of the people who is also on our positive psychology listserv is Darshan Narvaez, who wrote a book called The Neurobiology of Human Morality. And she goes into great detail about how the way we relate to others is wired into who we are. And I would wonder whether it would also apply to these primal beliefs. And the idea that it has genetic, neurological, biological, endocrine components.
Yeah.
The vagal nerve, for example, and empathy and mirror neurons and compassion. I would wonder and want to know if there's a correlation in there with that. I think that could very well be the case.
Absolutely. I mean, I 100% agree. And the thing is that I would make a strong guess that it has to correlate to a substantial degree, both theoretically and because there's a host of biological markers that are strongly tied to the same thing that I've tied these beliefs to. So, and the causal implications are going to be interesting too. I don't know, like, I think that there's a whole bunch of biological reasons that could predispose us, for instance, to see the world as a boring place, where few things are worth exploring. But I think it's also within a fair bit of control as well. And so I think I mean, I think that that's a whole massive vein of work that needs to be done that we know extremely little about right now, but has got to yield. There's got to be rich things there, and we don't know to what degree chicken before the egg, if the biological markers come first or vice versa. Like, for instance, with safe, like safe, if you score low on safe, you basically see the world as a war zone. What are all the biological mechanisms at play when you're
Narvaez will give you lots of very concrete, specific explanations of how this happens. And the other thing that's really important that I learned from her is epigenetic components of it.
Okay.
Epigenetics is basically you've got something that you're programmed with genetically, but it may or may not become dominant. It's like I always give the example of a redwood seed from a redwood tree. You put it in a cup of sand, nothing happens. You put it in a cup of sand with water, a stunted little plant grows. You put it in a deep forest and you get a 300-foot tall tree.
Yeah.
Same genetics.
Yeah.
I think the same thing can be for different primal beliefs.
I agree.
So, and then the other thing is,
I agree.
I'm fascinated by these 5 that you don't have connected, because I'm very interested in bottom up and top down. And I look at them and I see interconnected and hierarchical and changing and even acceptable as all connected in a systemic way. If you look at systems theory, which is the step where science has moved beyond the mechanistic model, then in systems theory, it's about relationships and patterns and processes and emergence. Yeah. And I think that you could put almost all of these under systemic.
Yes. So I would, that makes a lot of sense to me. And in fact, in our third study in the paper, there was indicators that weakly suggested that 3 of those beliefs might group. I believe it was interconnected, hierarchical, and acceptable. and it totally makes sense. It's like a Buddhist thing almost. Like things aren't that different from each other. It's all connected.
Well, I got it from Fritjof Capra, who
Okay.
wrote the book Tao of Physics, and
Okay.
the
Well,
book
and that's what's fascinating about a lot of these different beliefs is that, and why I didn't want to study Weltanschauung, which is like worldview thinking, which is like you can have a million and one reasons, like metaphysical backstories to see the world as, for instance, a just place. But that's not what I study, and I don't really care where the belief comes from. I just want to know now, what do you think about the world, not where it came from. And so to get back to your point, I totally agree that there's a relationship between the three that are that a few of them that aren't a part of the rest of the structure. I would say one, if there is a relationship, it's a weaker one. So like the safe ones are deeply tied together.
oh yeah,
But even within, like, there are some that clustered more than others, like within the safe ones. And there's some that clustered. So there's a whole rich world of like different profiles and whatnot that if you hold these sets of beliefs this way and this set of belief this way, then that would suggest that you are X, Y, and Z. That's going to take some more statistical sophistication that I have yet learned. But I'm excited to partner with people who want to do that. I think there's just a ton to explore. One of the important ones is the one that you just mentioned.
I'll throw another one at you. I asked you what's the opposite of enticing, and you said dull.
Yeah.
Another way of looking at enticement is attraction.
Yeah.
And when I think of attraction, it makes me think of conversations I've had about power.
Mm-hmm.
With power, there's soft power and there's hard power. Soft power attracts, hard power forces.
Okay.
And I don't know, I'm just throwing stuff out here. So,
yeah. Well, this is what's been interesting about all of these opposites is that one of the things that I became a bit of a psychometric expert to some small degree is that I realized how many scales measure something with only forward scored questions and then go on and make claims about the thing as if they know what it is. And when they try to measure reverse scored questions that they think should load onto the forward scored questions, don't load. And so that's why I cared so much to be like, no, we need to know what the opposites of all of these things are. And in some cases, we were completely wrong. So I'll tell you, we tried to measure more beliefs than this. Like, this is partly why I'm like, I didn't come up with this list of beliefs. Like, we threw more beliefs than this into a factor analysis process. And this is the structure that came out of it. Like, I didn't identify the belief that the world is safe and enticing and live. Like, that's what the factor analysis.
You're getting into some monkey stuff, which is nice. Sure. We don't have that much time. I want to do another show ID, and so let's do that, and then we'll.
All right, sounds good.
I want to talk about where this can go and all the applications and potential. Okay.
Okay, sounds good.
Little pause then, just for my edit. My guest is Jer Clifton. He's a doctoral student at the University of Pennsylvania Department of Psychology. I've met him through the Positive Psychology Listserv group, and he's the co-author of a seminal article that I think is going to shake the world called Primal World Beliefs. So as we're talking, I'm thinking about all the ways that this is going to be applicable. This could be $1 billion industry. This whole thing right here. It makes me think of, for one thing, of Cambridge Analytics, which the Mercer family exploited by collecting data from Facebook. But it also makes me think that Facebook would probably pay you a real lot of money to use your ideas to study what's going on. And you could probably get funding from them. I don't know if you want to get funding from them, but if you control it, then it could be fascinating. Also, I would think that in terms of politics, polling, marketing, all of this is going to be massive.
What's crazy about it is that there's a distinct possibility that you're right.
Yeah.
And we don't know how it can look I'm also humbled too. It's a privilege to work with Marty because Martin Seligman, because his ideas have been used in ways that he couldn't foresee, and some of which he doesn't approve of. And I also think that this research could potentially, but I do think that's getting ahead of ourselves. Like, we haven't demonstrated the causal nature of these beliefs. But if the
Hey,
paradigm,
you know what? They used salicylic acid from trees for thousands, probably tens of thousands of years before they knew how it worked or what it came, how it was derived. So the power you have is already something that is present, and
yeah. Well, and it helps people understand the world. Like, when I first figured out how to write a t-test, or how to run a t-test, which for those of you who don't know is like a basic stats test that like you learn at your first stats class. I learned how to do that 3 years ago, and I published a piece on politics on my little blog that only like my mom looks at and my one friend. And I got 70,000 hits in the next 3 weeks and multiple press requests. And I got scared because like I just learned how to run a t-test. So and it also convinced me, I think there's a lot of power in these ideas, and that's just politics. Like, I was working with a undergrad who wanted to use the differences, the main distinction between the world as a safe place versus the world is an enticing place, and how to sell cars. So for instance, if you think the world is a deeply unsafe place, then maybe when I sell you a car, I should emphasize all of the safety features. If you think the world is a really enticing place, maybe you don't care as much about the safety features, but you want to portray the car as like your buddy to explore the world. Like, you take it camping and through the city and like,
wow.
and like, but we haven't run that study yet. And that's just an example. I'm also unsure about applications where there's a friend of mine who's pretty high up in the business world, and he's convinced that certain beliefs predict being good at certain jobs. And we've looked at some of the data, and that is true to some degree. And people thinking about if they want to screen people for certain jobs based on these beliefs, like I'm not sure what I think about that yet. That seems like a serious ethical question. But at the same time, would you want to hire someone who has a belief like I'm worthless or I'm a worthless person? Like, probably not. But if someone thinks that the world is worthless or not worth exploring or like dull and ugly, that does predict well-being and a whole bunch of other things that might relate.
It sure does.
But my clear hope, much more so, is that these beliefs, if they do anything, they have massive implications for understanding each other and where each other are coming from, and well-being and personality traits. So for instance, we find that it is extremely unlikely to be a grateful person if you don't score high on the belief that the world is enticing. And we think of gratefulness as like a moral dimension, right? Like, you're a good person if you're a grateful person and you thank people for things and you feel grateful for things. And you're a bad person if you don't feel that way. We find that it's massively connected to a belief about what the world just objectively is.
Well, how did you do that? How did you find that gratitude was tied to belief that the world was enticing?
So again, this is correlational research. So when I made my scale, in one study we administered the Primal's inventory to 530 people, I believe, and they also took a dispositional gratitude scale by someone whose name I'm forgetting at the moment. And those questions are like, I go out of my way to thank people in my life. The older I get, the more grateful I am for things. And a few questions like that. They self-report on their actions. Not whether they should be a grateful person or not. They're saying like, do I tend to give thanks? That correlated with the belief that the world is an enticing place at 0.7, which is a massive relationship for those who don't know how to interpret effect sizes, which I didn't know how to do up until a few years ago. And that relationship holds when controlling for how much money you make, education, a whole bunch of other things. So it's not just like rich people are grateful, or you're grateful because you have a lot. What's important is know what you just think if the world is full of things to be grateful for in the first place. So, but we don't know yet what comes first. Maybe people are dispositionally grateful, and that causes them to have high scores on my questionnaire. Or people think the world is full of things to be grateful for, and that's why they're grateful. We don't know.
It's fascinating. So we're getting down. We've got about 5 minutes left. If this exceeds your dreams, which I think it's already done, right?
It's exceeded my dreams in the sense of the amount of attention that I got. And I had no idea that the evidence would be so clear that these beliefs exist.
And I think it's opening up so many new questions and ideas. It's incredible, really. And like you told me before we got started, this is going to be your life's work.
Yeah.
I mean, to have a dream, to have something unfold into your life's work, can't think of a much better dream than that, really.
Yeah. Yeah.
So if as the dream continues, how will it change the world and make the world a better place? How will it help people?
Well, there are, as you mentioned, massive implications, some of them with ethical dimensions that I'm not sure where I fall on yet. I think that if it exceeds beyond my wildest dreams, and my basic theory proves correct, that much of what we do and become in life is we do in reaction to these beliefs that we hold, then we're going to be able to understand each other a lot better. We will be able to understand our neurotic aunt when she's freaking out about things. We'll also know, oh no, but she just thinks that this world is much more like a war zone than what I think, and it's a rational response to that. So hopefully, that'll lead to a massive increase in our ability to empathize and understand the world from each other's perspectives. The other thing is that I think people are going to figure out ways to change these beliefs. I don't think that they're set in stone. I don't think that we debate these beliefs, and I don't think we ever I think that people can be open to the possibility that they could be wrong, especially when they discover that people around them whom they love and respect disagree with them in fundamental ways. Like I would guess, I know me and my spouse disagree in fundamental ways about our primals. That influences our relationship, we think. And now I've given a language to that. I think that there will be clinical implications. I think people who see the world a certain way are at more risk for anxiety or depression. So there might be a whole bunch of implications there. People with certain primals are going to be better at certain jobs. We've found some primals, for instance, that predict success amongst police. And I don't want to say what those are yet because that research is ongoing. But there's a whole bunch of different ways that I think that people will use this research to help themselves and to help each other and to understand each other. And mainly, I think that it's entirely possible that millions of people are trapped in implicit worlds that they didn't know they were trapped into, and their actions hurt themselves and people that aren't trapped in those worlds. And so this at least allows them to have a choice, and it allows them to understand that they don't have to see the world the way that they do. But I'm also, like, I said all these positive things. I'm also quite scared that primals could be used to control populations, to become more acquiescent. I think it's possible that people may want to believe whatever it is they believe, even if it's not as good for their well-being, and they'll be discriminated against to some degree. That's also a possibility. So we have to put this in the context of, but my hope is just that we use this language to discuss the different worlds that we're from, and how that makes sense of how we think and what we do.
So one last question. I'm interested in psychopaths and narcissists. Is there any tie-in that you see with those?
Very good question. So in the first study that we did, we measured the dark triad. So Machiavellianism, narcissism, and psychopathy. What was interesting is while primals very much predict big five traits, so they predict the major personality traits, they're not that predictive. They're not as predictive as we thought they would be of essentially being a bad person, which is nice. Like, people can see the world as a bad place, and it doesn't mean that they're bad people. They just think that they happen to live in a world that's a bad place. So for instance, well, not for instance, there was one exception to what I just said. And one of the beliefs that we study is the belief that the world is interactive. So it's interacting with you, it's responding to you, it's about you in some way. So people who score high on this belief tend to think that, like, something like, if it rains, this is a sign from the universe that instead of going to the park, I should call my mom and make up for the fight that we had last week, or something like that.
Karma.
Sorry?
Karma.
No, maybe. Karma, I think, is more related to the belief that the world's a just place.
Okay.
So you get what you deserve and deserve what you get. But they might think it's just because That
Okay, so, but if it's raining and it reminds you to think of your mother because you're an interactive. What is that? How's that tie in with the?
So that correlates with being a narcissist at about 0.3.
Not that high.
Yeah. So it's like, so narcissists tend to think the world is about them. And people who think that the world is interactive tend to also think that the world is about them. But that was the biggest relationship that was there. So for instance, the belief that the world is a competitive place, we thought would predict Machiavellianism. And the correlation was not very high. It was like 0.1.
All right. We need a wrap. This has been awesome, fascinating. My guest for this show has been Clifton, who's a doctoral student at the University of Pennsylvania Department of Psychology, and he's the first author of a landmark study, Primal World Beliefs. Thanks so much, Jer.
Thanks, Rob.